Sickles and war picks could be devastating in historical combat, but what if... As is the custom on this channel, apparently, people sometimes ask me about particular anime weapons and want to know how practical they would be in real life. And when I first saw this thing from Naruto, I couldn't help but groan and roll my eyes, because not only is it a triple scythe, it's also attached to a length of rope and is being thrown, because of course, why wouldn't it? But then I thought about it some more and maybe there's some merit to it. Let's take a closer look. So sickles and kamas, even though they were originally agricultural tools, can be brutally effective in combat. There are a few sources here and there that show the use of them, and I've tried it out in sparring and also tests on ballistic dummies and whatnot. Yes, they definitely work. Really, the only disadvantage is how short they are. It can be extremely challenging to get to within your reach against a longer weapon. So what's an easy solution to that? Well, put it at the end of a long pole. So now you don't have a reach disadvantage anymore. I've got this scythe because I'm planning to make a video about actual historical scythe techniques. I still need to get around to making a spare blade that's safe for sparring, you know, whether it's blunt steel or aluminum or nylon or something. I just haven't had the time for it yet. A standard agricultural scythe, of course, has the problem that it's not designed for combat. So generally these blades are really thin, like to the point of being fragile, at least a lot of them. There are different types. Either way, you can just modify them a little bit and make them perfectly viable for combat. So what if you triple it? Just put another 2 on there. Does that make any sense? Well, let's look at the pros and cons. An obvious appeal in a fantasy scenario is...
it looks cool.
Right? That's debatable. Depending on who you are, it might just look silly, but fair enough. That doesn't really translate to any real life advantage other than maybe it's intimidating. Now, experienced warriors are not psyched out easily. If you went back in time and confronted a knight with a triple scythe, he would probably look at you like you're insane and then proceed to crush you. But you might be able to scare a rookie, at least. Fair enough. So what else is there? Well, if you have 3 blades, or even just 2, it's easier to trap an opponent's blade. You can always hook and try to control an opponent's blade, even with just 1. Just the fact that it's mounted perpendicular gives you some options. But of course, if you have more than 1 blade, there is a chance to trap an opponent's weapon in between and make it harder for them to withdraw it, so you can manipulate it more easily and control it. You can also not attack at the same time while they're bound up, so there is that, but that's a potential feature you can use. A more significant advantage of multiple blades is that they make it easier to hit the target. Assuming you're using a war pick style penetrating attack, which is generally the most effective. You can cut with the edge, but it can be pretty difficult because most angles are out. In combat, it's not easy to actually perform a hewing cut, basically. As such, it's always going to impact with the point rather than the edge. There's some situations where you might be able to slice, you know, like hook behind a limb and then pull and try to cut that way, which is not easy. A sickle like this, you absolutely can, because it's not a perpendicular angle. It's most of the edge is more or less parallel to the handle, and then it becomes perpendicular toward the edge. So it's absolutely possible to cut like this. That is a lot more difficult. So if you have this sort of configuration, then and you want to attack with a point, this is all you got to work with, right? So your accuracy needs to be within this area here. If you miss, you know, if somebody swings this at me, they're aiming for my chest and they're quite a bit off, and it goes over top. So now it just hits me with the haft, which isn't, I mean, it'll still hurt, but not as much as this, obviously. Particularly if you aim for limbs, this is extremely difficult to actually hit a moving target with such a small area. So if you have 3 points of contact, you have 3 times the chance, about, to hit a target. And then of course, if the attack lands, it inflicts 3 wounds instead of 1. That doesn't mean 3 times the damage, keep that in mind, because with one of these, if it's just 1 blade, you concentrate all the force of that strike on 1 small area, which is why war picks are so frickin' devastating, and similar weapons. If you have 3 blades, now you're distributing the force over 3 points of contact rather than 1. So each one is going to penetrate less than the single one. Now with a war pick or similar design, how much does it matter? Not really all that much, because they tend to overpenetrate. Even against armor, this is ridiculous. We've seen that in various tests. So it takes very little effort to just sink this right up to the haft into various targets, no problem. So if it does get distributed across 3 points of entry, it's still plenty. There's still plenty of power behind it. So that's something that I used to point out. You know, you're dividing it by 3 more or less. Might not be that big of a deal because of the excess of force that it offers. All right, so what about the cons? First off, it takes longer to make. Instead of 1 blade or spike or whatever, you have to make 3, and you have to attach them to the handle. So it's just more effort, more time needed, more cost. The next disadvantage weighs in pretty heavily. Weight. It's almost 3 times the mass. Not quite, because of course the handle or haft weighs some too, but you're adding a significant amount of weight and thereby it's clunkier. Michael Cthulhu made one of these triple scythes, of course he did, and you can tell. Even though he gets the customary blacksmith plus 3 strength bonus or whatever it is, he struggles with it. The thing is quite heavy.
It weighs like 45 pounds.
It's extremely unwieldy. So that's, of course, a problem. If you're fighting an opponent with a lighter, more agile weapon, you're in trouble, because it's going to take you longer to accelerate and decelerate it. It's going to take you longer to recover after a swing. So an opponent with a lighter weapon, if they know how, they can easily exploit it, just evade, counterattack, while you're still struggling to move back to a guard and then defend. However, this depends on exactly how you do it. The easiest way would be if you take a pole arm and simply redistribute the weight. So instead of 1 heavier blade, you turn it into 3 lighter blades. Like you take the same amount of steel and you just make each individual blade thinner and perhaps smaller overall in profile. And there are some pretty hefty pole arms in history. If we look at this real-life partisan, for example, it weighs about 3 kilograms or well over 6 pounds. That's rather hefty. So you could take the same amount of steel and shape it into 3 individual sickle or scythe or war pick blades. It's doable. And the final disadvantage that comes to mind is 3 points of entry also means 3 times the risk of getting stuck. So whenever a weapon like this breaks through armor or enters a body, there are a number of things that can go wrong. In fact, if just one of these 3 blades hits a harder part, be it a thicker, harder part of the armor or a thick bone or something like that, it might stop the weapon altogether. So there's basically 3 times the risk of hitting something that it just can't penetrate past, producing a shallow wound. Or even if it penetrates all the way, it's going to be more difficult to withdraw it, because one of the blades might hook behind a bone or, some macabre mechanic like that. A lot of things can happen. There's one other benefit, but it's a give and take. It's pros and cons. If you have 3 blades instead of 1, there's some redundancy. So if one blade gets damaged or breaks or snaps right off the haft, you have 2 more to work with. So the triple version of such a weapon can sustain more damage before it becomes unusable. The drawback is, if you want to maintain the same or at least a similar amount of mass to not make it overly clunky, then each individual blade is more fragile. If you just have one single blade with whatever mass you're working with, how much steel you want to use, then it's going to be thicker and just more robust. If you make 3 out of the same material, or at least similar, even if you increase it a little bit, each individual blade is going to be significantly less sturdy. So you're risking more damage anyway. So if we look at the practical pros and cons, style and aesthetics aside, it's an even number, so it actually seems pretty balanced. So it seems like a good weapon, potentially. Well, it seems like in history, people didn't really agree. Or at least, for one reason or another, it wasn't really done. For the most part. There are 2 exceptions I was able to find. There might be more, but these are the only ones I'm aware of. One is a Chinese polearm, the G, which usually is made with 1 blade, but there are a few examples of triple-bladed versions. And in this case, there's quite a bit of space in between the different blades. So I'm assuming one of the pros of this was exactly what they had in mind here, that it's easier to hit the target because they're more evenly spaced. If you miss with one, you're most likely going to connect with the other 2, or at least 1 out of 3. So that was done. And there are also triple-bladed Native American gunstock war clubs. That's a different approach. The 3 are spaced pretty tightly here. Now, I don't know for sure if these were really used in real-life combat, because at least some gunstock war clubs were intended for ceremonial use. That can be difficult to suss out either way, but at least they existed. So it seems that generally people in history either thought the cons outweigh the pros, or it just straight up didn't occur to them. Not everything that wasn't made and used back then is completely useless. If you think about the question, why didn't they invent XYZ earlier in history? They had the materials, the technology earlier, but they didn't. Why not? Well, probably because they didn't think of it. It just took a while until somebody eventually had the idea and implemented it, and there you go. Anyway, that's about all I've got. Just one more thing, a little detail about the placement of the edge. You can see on Hidan's scythe from Naruto, the top looks like it's sharpened, which makes perfect sense, at least in case of the top scythe blade, because the bottom edge you wouldn't be able to use. In this case, it's the same all throughout, just to make it visually consistent. What you would want to do in this case of 3 blades would be a sharpened edge on top of the top blade, then really no edge on the center blade, because you're not going to be able to cut with it either way. You can't apply the edge to anything. And then on the bottom blade, the edge should be at the bottom, so that you can actually potentially cut with this. The most effective on a scythe would actually be an edge on top, because this is relatively easy to cut with for a rising cut. The inside edge is more difficult to use depending on the exact angle. Anyway, hope you found this interesting and entertaining. Thanks for watching. Don't mind the snowplow out there. That's hella noisy. I don't know if you can hear it. Anyway, have a good one. Take care.